The rain fell in silence over the forests of the Hurtgen, November 2nd, 1944. It was the kind of rain that soaked through wool and leather, that turned earth into something closer to clay than soil. In the dense canopy of fir and pine, where light barely penetrated even at midday, American soldiers moved through a landscape that seemed designed to swallow men whole. The trees stood so close together that tanks could not pass. Artillery shells, when they struck the upper branches, exploded into wooden shrapnel that tore through flesh as efficiently as any metal. The forest floor was a maze of roots and ravines, of hidden bunkers and wire traps that the Germans had spent months perfecting. And in that cold, wet darkness, something happened that the United States Army would spend the next 5 decades trying to forget. If you find these stories of courage and strategy inspiring, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us keep these historical legacies alive. The Battle of Hurtgen Forest would become the longest single battle the U.S. Army fought in World War II. It lasted from September 1944 to February 1945. More than 33,000 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in those woods. The Germans lost a similar number, but those statistics, stark as they are, do not tell the full story. Because buried within the official records, hidden in classified reports that would not see daylight until 1994, was an incident so disturbing that it challenged every narrative the American military had constructed about itself. It was an event that revealed not the nobility of war, but its capacity to reduce civilized men to something unrecognizable. And it involved not the enemy, but the Americans themselves. To understand what happened in those woods, one must first understand what the Hurtgen Forest represented in the autumn of 1944. By September, the Allies had liberated Paris. The great breakthrough from Normandy had succeeded beyond even the most optimistic projections. General Eisenhower's forces were driving toward Germany's western border, and there was genuine belief among the command staff that the war might be over by Christmas. The soldiers felt it too. They had survived D-Day, pushed through the hedgerows of Normandy, liberated French villages where grateful civilians threw flowers and offered wine. They were winning. They were the liberators. They carried with them not just rifles and ammunition, but an entire ideology about what American soldiers represented: democracy, justice, the moral high ground. The Hurtgen Forest stood directly in the path toward the Roer River dams, strategic targets that, if left in German hands, could be used to flood the entire river valley and halt any Allied advance. The forest itself was 50 square miles of dense woodland straddling the Belgian-German border. German forces had been fortifying it since September, transforming it into a defensive network of pillboxes, minefields, and interconnected bunker systems. The trees themselves became weapons. The Germans knew that American doctrine relied on air superiority and mechanized warfare. In the Hurtgen, neither advantage meant anything. Planes could not see through the canopy. Tanks could not maneuver between the trees. It would be infantry against infantry, close-quarters combat in conditions that resembled the trenches of World War I more than the mobile warfare of 1944. The American commanders who ordered the assault believed it would take a week, perhaps 2. They expected their well-trained, well-supplied divisions to push through German resistance with the same momentum they had shown in France. What they did not account for was that the Hurtgen Forest was not France. It was a killing ground, a place where every advantage the Americans possessed was neutralized by geography and German tactical brilliance. The 9th Infantry Division entered the forest first in mid-September. Within 3 weeks, they had advanced less than 3 miles and sustained nearly 4,500 casualties. They were pulled out and replaced by the 28th Infantry Division, which suffered even worse. In 1 week in early November, the 28th lost over 6,000 men. Entire companies vanished. Men stepped on mines that had been planted beneath the leaves and lost their legs. They were shot by snipers they never saw. They died from hypothermia in foxholes that filled with freezing water. And slowly, incrementally, the psychological fabric of the American units began to unravel. The soldiers who entered the Hurtgen expected to be heroes. They had been raised on stories of American exceptionalism, had been told since basic training that they were part of the greatest military force ever assembled. They believed in the cause. They believed in their training. They believed that their nation's industrial might and moral clarity would see them through any, Challenge. What they discovered in the forest was that belief was not enough. Courage was not enough. In the Hurtgen, men discovered that they could do everything right and still die randomly, senselessly, without even seeing the enemy. There were soldiers who survived Normandy only to break completely in the woods, sitting in their foxholes rocking back and forth, no longer able to hold their rifles. The army had a term for it: combat exhaustion. The numbers were staggering. By the end of November, the psychiatric casualty rate in some units approached 30%. Men were not just being killed, they were being psychologically destroyed at a rate the medical corps had never seen. And it was in this context, this atmosphere of grinding attrition and psychological collapse, that the hidden event occurred. It happened in mid-November, during the 28th Division's final days in the forest before they were pulled out, shattered and barely functional as a fighting force. The official records from that period are sparse, deliberately so. But the classified after-action reports that were finally declassified 50 years later, along with testimony from survivors that was suppressed at the time, reveal what happened. A company from the 110th Infantry Regiment, approximately 120 men, had been ordered to take a small German-held village on the eastern edge of the forest. The village had no strategic value beyond being a point on the map that represented forward progress. The men who received the order knew it was futile. They had been in the forest for 2 weeks. They had watched half their company die or evacuate with injuries or psychiatric breaks. They were exhausted, underfed, and operating in a state of perpetual fear. But orders were orders. They moved out before dawn on November 16th. The attack failed within the first hour. German machine gun positions, perfectly concealed and interlocking, cut down the first 2 platoons before they got within 100 yards of the village. The survivors retreated into the tree line, dragging what wounded they could. Among those killed was the company commander, a captain who had been well liked and who had tried, as much as conditions allowed, to keep his men's morale intact. His death broke something. The remaining officers, a first lieutenant and 2 second lieutenants fresh from officer training, were paralyzed by indecision. The men were trapped in positions they could not hold, too far forward to safely retreat in daylight, unable to advance. And as the day wore on, the Germans began to shell their positions methodically. It was the shelling that triggered what came next. Not the sudden violence of an artillery barrage, but the slow, deliberate torture of it. The Germans had them ranged perfectly. Every 20 minutes, another salvo would land. Not enough to kill everyone quickly, but enough to ensure casualties with each strike, enough to keep every man in a state of anticipatory terror, knowing the next shells were coming and being powerless to stop them. Men began to crack. Some started screaming and would not stop. Others dug frantically into the frozen ground with their hands, trying to burrow deeper than their entrenching tools could manage. And one man, a private from Ohio, whose name appears in the classified documents but which will not be repeated here out of respect for his descendants, began shooting at his own squad mates. It was not a deliberate act of murder in any premeditated sense. His mind had fractured. He saw enemies everywhere. In the chaos and terror, he fired his M1 Garand into the men around him, killing 2 before he was tackled and disarmed. But the incident created a cascade effect. Other men, already on the edge of psychological collapse, interpreted the gunfire as a German attack from within their own lines. They began firing at shadows, at each other. The situation descended into fratricide, American soldiers killing Americans in the belief they were defending themselves against infiltrators. By the time the surviving officers regained control, 11 men were dead from friendly fire, and another 16 were wounded. That night, under cover of darkness, the survivors retreated. They left their dead behind, something that violated every principle the army had drilled into them. But they were no longer functioning as soldiers. They were traumatized men fleeing a place that had destroyed them. When they reached American lines, they were incoherent. The officers reported that they had been overrun, that casualties were heavy, that the position was untenable. They did not mention the fratricide. They could not. To admit what had happened would be to admit that American soldiers, the soldiers of democracy and liberation, had turned on each other in panic and terror. The official after-action report filed on November 18th recorded the engagement as a failed assault with heavy casualties from German fire. The bodies were recovered 2 days later during a brief ceasefire. They were buried quickly, their graves marked with temporary crosses. The survivors of the company were dispersed to other units. Some were quietly discharged with psychiatric diagnoses. Others were kept in service but transferred away from frontline combat roles. And the truth of what happened was sealed in classified reports that would remain hidden for 50 years. Why was it hidden? The answer lies in what the American military needed to believe about itself in 1944, and what the American public needed to believe about their soldiers. The narrative of World War II, as it was being constructed even while the war was still being fought, was one of moral clarity. The United States was fighting a just war against fascism. American soldiers were citizen soldiers, fundamentally decent men who fought not because they loved war, but because they loved freedom. They were not the brutal, fanatical soldiers of the Wehrmacht or the Imperial Japanese Army. They were better. They represented something better. An incident like the one in the Hurtgen Forest contradicted that narrative at a fundamental level. It revealed that under sufficient stress, under the right conditions of fear and exhaustion and hopelessness, American soldiers could break just as completely as any other soldiers. They could kill their own. They could descend into chaos. They were, in the end, human, with all the fragility and capacity for collapse that humanity entails. The Army's decision to classify the incident was not merely about covering up a mistake. It was about protecting a myth that was essential to the war effort and to post-war American identity. If the public learned that American soldiers had killed each other in panic, that officers had lost control, that men had broken psychologically at rates approaching 30% in some engagements, it would have raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of combat, the limits of human endurance, and whether the costs of the Hurtgen offensive were justified. Because the truth, which military historians would only begin to fully articulate decades later, was that the Battle of Hurtgen Forest was a strategic failure. The ground gained had minimal tactical value. The casualties were disproportionate to any objective achieved. The offensive was continued not because it made strategic sense, but because commanders at various levels were unwilling to admit that it had been a mistake to enter the forest in the first place. There is a detail from the classified reports that is worth noting, a small thing that appears in the testimony of one of the surviving officers. He described finding, after the chaos of the friendly fire incident had subsided, a German propaganda leaflet that had been left in the woods. The leaflet was one of thousands that German psychological warfare units had been distributing throughout the forest. It showed a picture of a comfortable American home, a family, around a dinner table with a roasted turkey and all the abundance that symbolized American prosperity. The text, in English, read, "What are you dying for? Your leaders are safe. Your families are comfortable. But you are here, freezing and dying in a forest that is not yours, for a war that is already won. Go home." The officer had crumpled the leaflet and thrown it away, but the image stayed with him, because it was true, in a sense. The soldiers in the Hurtgen were dying for objectives that would be abandoned within months. They were suffering not because the war required it, but because the machinery of military command, once set in motion, was difficult to stop. The survivors of the 110th Infantry who knew what really happened that day carried the knowledge with them for the rest of their lives. Most never spoke of it, even to their families. Some tried. There are oral histories, recorded decades later, where veterans would begin to describe their time in the Hurtgen, and then stop, unable to continue, the memories too painful or too shameful to articulate. One veteran, interviewed in the 1980s, said only, "We did things in those woods that we don't talk about, not because we were ordered not to, but because we can't. Because if we told you what it was really like, you wouldn't believe us. Or worse, you would, and then you'd know that there's no such thing as a good war." The incident remained classified until 1994, when a broader declassification of World War II documents was undertaken. Even then, it received little public attention. By 1994, the veterans of World War II were in their 70s and 80s. The national narrative of the war as the good war was firmly established. The Hurtgen Forest, to the extent it was remembered at all, was a footnote, an unfortunate but minor setback in an otherwise triumphant campaign. The specific incident of fratricide did not fit into that story, and so it remained obscure, buried in archives that few researchers consulted. But for military historians and psychologists, the incident and the broader experience of the Hurtgen Forest represent something crucial. They represent evidence that combat has limits beyond which human psychology cannot be pushed without breaking. Modern militaries understand this now. The concept of combat rotation, of pulling units out of frontline service after a certain period to rest and reconstitute, is a direct legacy of lessons learned from battles like the Hurtgen. The understanding that psychological casualties are as real and as debilitating as physical ones is a legacy of battles like the Hurtgen. But in 1944, those lessons had not yet been learned, or if they had been learned in World War I, they had been forgotten. The soldiers in the Hurtgen forest were expected to fight until they were physically incapable of continuing, and the army was unprepared for the scale of psychiatric collapse that resulted. There is a final image from the classified reports that serves as a kind of coda to the entire incident. After the surviving members of the company had been pulled back and dispersed, a chaplain was sent to interview them as part of the Army's effort to understand what had happened. He spoke with dozens of men individually. His report, which is included in the declassified documents, notes that many of the men expressed not guilt or shame about the friendly fire incident, but a kind of numb resignation. They did not see what had happened as an aberration or a failure on their part. They saw it as the inevitable result of being placed in an impossible situation. One soldier told the chaplain, "We weren't soldiers anymore by the end. We were just animals trying to survive. And when animals get scared enough, they bite anything near them." The chaplain's report concluded with a recommendation that the men receive psychiatric care and that the incident be studied to prevent similar breakdowns in the future. His recommendations were filed and largely ignored. The Army in 1944 did not have the resources or the conceptual framework to implement large-scale psychiatric intervention. The war had to be won, and soldiers, broken or not, were needed. So the survivors were patched up as best as possible and sent back into service, and the incident was sealed away where it could not complicate the narrative of American valor and moral superiority. In the years after the war, some of those men built normal lives. They returned home, married, had children, worked jobs, participated in their communities. Others did not. The suicide rate among Hurtgen survivors was notably higher than among veterans of other European campaigns, though the data is incomplete because the VA did not systematically track such things in the 1950s and 1960s. There were men who drank themselves to death, who could not hold jobs, who estranged themselves from their families because they could not explain what they had, experienced, or what it had done to them. Post-traumatic stress disorder would not be formally recognized as a diagnosis until 1980. The men who suffered from it after the Hurtgen forest had no name for what was wrong with them, and often neither did their doctors. The forest itself still stands, a quiet place now, popular with hikers and nature enthusiasts. There are memorials scattered throughout, markers for the divisions that fought there. Visitors can walk the same trails where soldiers once advanced and died. The bunkers are still there, concrete structures slowly being reclaimed by moss and roots. And occasionally, even now, hikers will find remnants of the battle, a rusted helmet, a fragment of shell casing, bones that were never recovered. The earth holds memory better than humans do. What does this hidden event teach us, now that it is no longer hidden? It teaches us that war, even a just war, even a necessary war, is not ennobling. It teaches us that there is a cost to combat that goes beyond the physical, a cost that is paid in shattered minds and broken spirits. It teaches us that the myth of the invincible soldier, the man who can endure anything because his cause is righteous and his nation is strong, is a dangerous myth. Soldiers are human. They break. And when they break, the consequences can be as tragic as any enemy action. It teaches us, too, that institutions will protect their own narratives at the expense of truth. The Army's decision to classify the Hurtgen incident was understandable from a pragmatic standpoint. But it was also a betrayal of the men who suffered. By hiding what happened, the Army ensured that the lessons of the Hurtgen forest would not be fully learned, that future soldiers would be sent into impossible situations without the support structures that might have saved them. The cost of that institutional protectionism was measured in the lives and mental health of the men who served in the decades that followed, and, perhaps most importantly, it teaches us that the narrative we construct about our wars shapes how we prepare for the next ones. The story of World War II as the Good War, the war where America saved the world and American soldiers were uniformly heroic, is a story that has made it easier to enter subsequent conflicts with unrealistic expectations about what war does to people. Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. Each of these wars produced their own Hurtgen forests, their own incidents of soldiers breaking under stress, their own uncomfortable truths that were initially hidden or downplayed because they contradicted the narrative of American military invincibility. The rain still falls in the Hurtgen forest in November, just as it did in 1944. The trees still stand dense and dark, and somewhere beneath those trees, in earth that has long since absorbed the blood and bone of the men who died there, lies the truth that took 50 years to emerge, that there are limits to human endurance, that even the most just cause cannot protect soldiers from the psychological devastation of prolonged combat, and that the cost of war is always higher than the official records admit. The soldiers who fought in the Hurtgen forest expected to be liberators, heroes, the armed representatives of democracy and freedom. What they experienced instead was something darker and more true. The reality that in war, there are no clean victories, no uncomplicated heroes, only men trying to survive in conditions that reduce humanity to its most desperate and fragile elements. And that truth, uncomfortable as it is the one legacy of the Hurtgen forest that we cannot afford to hide again. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this historical deep dive, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which historical figure we should cover next.